This is the video game in its purest form. Free from the hustle and bustle of modern life and modern gaming, Tetris is as finely honed a concept as one could ask for. Even decades after its initial release, Tetris persists in the hearts and minds of many. It is, simply put, the perfect game. Or is it? You see, while Tetris as a concept remains a classic example of focused gameplay, there is room to push the concept from addictive game to near spiritual journey. I speak, of course, of Tetris Effect. And today I'm here to examine what it is that makes this iteration of the puzzle classic so remarkable. The concept of fusing music with puzzle gameplay is certainly nothing new for producer Tetsuya Mizuguchi. This is a core tenet of his games after all, but I believe Tetris Effect represents perhaps the best effort yet. Today then, we're taking a journey through time to explore the visual evolution of Tetris in many of its most beloved forms. Since its inception, Tetris has evolved visually, aurally, and in terms of play. And it is amazing to see just how far this simple puzzle game has come. So join me on this special episode of DF Retro with a touch of modern gaming as we explore the world of Tetris Effect and beyond. Tetris, the story behind its inception and eventual arrival in the West, is one of legend. But for this video, all you need to know is that it started with this. Created in 1984 by Alexei Pajitnov and Dmitry Pavlovsky, this original iteration of Tetris was first prototyped for an old Russian computer system, the Electronika 60, an unauthorized clone of a Russian PDP-11 system. Written in the Pascal language, this original version relies on characters as opposed to bitmapped graphics, as this class of computer could not support them. Even in this simplistic form, it worked, and was soon ported to the IBM PC thanks to a young high school student named Vadim Gerasimov, introducing the first major visual evolution, color. Blocks were divided up into individual colors as opposed to monochromatic alphanumeric characters. This change allows for smoother gameplay as it becomes easier to identify block patterns and useful shapes at a glance. Both original Tetris games feature the same basic mechanics, however. You can move your blocks left and right, rotate them in one direction, and hard drop the blocks onto the stack with a single button press. The playfield consists of a 10 by 20 matrix, a design principle adhered to by most other Tetris games that would follow. It works, but it was just the start. Now, the distribution rights for Tetris were a mess. Multiple deals with different publishers across various regions resulted in a flood of Tetris games starting in the late 80s. Over the course of this video, we'll examine many notable versions of Tetris, but due to the sheer volume of games and the fact that Tetris exists on just about everything with a CPU, we're not going to be able to cover every single version. Let's begin our journey with one of the most infamous releases, the original bulletproof software conversion for Nintendo Famicom, which was developed and sold without the proper console rights, a situation that would eventually lead to Nintendo purchasing console rights thanks to Hank Rogers and his pursuit of portable rights for the upcoming Game Boy. While relatively obscure compared to other Tetris releases, this is a surprisingly faithful adaptation of the original game, but it's less intuitive to play if you're used to the current iterations. The main issues are the limited controls and the fact that you're limited to a hard drop rather than a soft drop. It's the difference between immediately dropping the block onto the stack versus lowering it at your own pace. Like the PC version, you rotate pieces by pressing the key between left and right. In the case of the Famicom, this means down on the D-pad. The hard drop then is assigned to one of the face buttons. It can be difficult to wrap your mind around the controls these days, but it plays well enough and it's fast. And visually, this version features fancier blocks and background designs compared to the original PC release, and was released only in Japan. The next Tetris game for NES was again developed by Bulletproof Software for Nintendo, and is one of the more common variants. This version is still relatively simple with single direction rotation, but it introduces the soft fall, a feature which allows you to hold down on the D-pad to accelerate block speed, but it lacks any of the advanced features that would soon follow, and doesn't even include the hard drop that was featured in the original release. The background graphics are all based on Tetris shapes pretty much, and are relatively simple in design, but it has a clean, colorful look. It's a solid version of Tetris, if a little bare bones. It is a marked improvement over the clunky Bulletproof Software version, however. Then there's Tengen Tetris. Due to a legal battle over console rights, this version of Tetris was quickly pulled from market, thus it remains a pricey cartridge for collectors. In comparison, this version sports an entirely different visual design. Blocks are shaded in a way to convey a 3D appearance and lack the segmented design of the other 8-bit version, and when blocks lock into place, they become a singular color. The game is also displayed in a 2-player side-by-side configuration even when playing alone. When you achieve a certain number of clears, you reach a score tally screen, which then changes the color of the locked playfield. This is basically equivalent to the B-type mode featured in some of the other versions. One neat touch in this game, visually at least, is the animation and text used when clearing a line. It looks really nice in motion. That said, I'm not a huge fan of the way this one plays, as pieces cannot be easily rotated against walls in certain instances, and the controls feel a little stiff with the way everything's timed, but it's still a decent version of Tetris. What's interesting about this NES version, however, is that it was derived from the Atari arcade release. Released a year prior, this NES version is a reasonably close facsimile of the arcade game. The same pseudo 3D appearance is retained, but overall visuals are slightly more detailed and higher resolution. From what I've read, this specific arcade board doesn't even utilize sprites for its objects, instead relying on a different mode entirely. But it's not the only arcade version from this era. Sega teamed up with Tengen and Alorg to create its own System 16 powered version of Tetris for Japanese arcades. This very popular release is one of the earlier versions of Tetris to feature colorful background imagery behind the playfield. As you progress, what appears to be digitized photos are drawn into the background, lending the game a rather different look and feel. Okay, it's not the first one with background graphics, of course, but I feel like it has a certain design language that we would see in subsequent releases from various other companies. Of course, this version also features a selection of colorful blocks that sort of have a glassy texture to them, and it looks really nice. This version is rather interesting as it introduces some of the mechanics that would become a staple of later Tetris games. This includes delayed auto shift, a feature where the block moves in a direction, pauses, then moves rapidly if the player continues to hold that direction. Then there's lock delay, where blocks do not immediately lock into place upon touching the wall, giving players a chance to maneuver slightly upon contact. And then there's the delay between placing a block and when a new block begins to fall from the top of the screen. It's a solid but challenging version, however, with restrictions placed on when you can rotate. You can't rotate against the ceiling, and there are limitations with rotating against walls. Now, Sega also ported this arcade game to the Mega Drive for use in Japan, but due to the licensing fiasco, this version was never really released. Copies do exist, but they fetch insane prices. The version being played for this video has been loaded onto a Mega EverDrive. It's one of the few versions that I don't have a physical copy of, unfortunately, due to its insane price and rarity. Visually, it's similar to the arcade game, but the blocks feature a more patterned design rather than the glassy look, and there are slight changes to the patterns around the playfield. It plays pretty well, but again, I found some frustration in the way it handles block rotation, making it slightly less enjoyable to play than some of the later iterations. Still, it's a shame that this version was never widely released, as it's still worth checking out and would have been a great game to have on the Mega Drive or Genesis. Over on the PC, however, Spectrum Holobyte was getting in on the action with its own release that looks like this. Spectrum was the first publisher to release Tetris games in the West, and this version was developed and released before the legal issues with Nintendo. This was one of the first versions to feature background graphics, and the game which started the trend of displaying Soviet-themed imagery alongside the gameplay. It features the hard drop rather than a soft drop and uses a single rotation key. You can also cycle through backgrounds at will if you'd like. This version was ported to various other computers as well, including the Macintosh, Amiga, and Atari ST. Now, before we jump into the 1990s, there is one more tremendously important version to discuss: Tetris for Nintendo Game Boy. For many people, the Nintendo Game Boy version of Tetris is the version they know best. This is where I first played the game, in fact, and its inclusion with the system in Europe and North America no doubt helped boost the popularity of both the Game Boy and Tetris itself. It has sold millions of copies since release, making it the most successful version of Tetris available. With the lack of color capability on the Game Boy, however, Nintendo opted instead to differentiate the pieces using patterns with different shades of green. While playfield width remains equal to other versions of the game, the height was slightly reduced from 20 to 18 blocks. This version supports link play and has 2 different modes available. This is as basic as it gets though, but those basics are well executed. It lacks all the advanced features of later revisions, but it does offer the soft drop. It's a simple, elegant version of Tetris, a pure version if you will. It also helped make this song rather popular. Thanks to the Game Boy version, this is basically the theme of Tetris. But before the decade would close out, Alexei Pajitnov would release a follow-up to Tetris, known as Weltris. The pseudo 3D perspective and wireframe graphics were suitably late 80s, but the gameplay was expanded in different ways, with blocks falling from 4 different walls into what amounts to a well, hence Weltris. Lines are still eliminated the same way, but spilling outside the playfield temporarily freezes a wall, preventing players from using it until it resets. It's a neat idea that more closely resembles the game of Pentominoes, which inspired Alexei in the first place, but I don't think it's quite as enjoyable as actual Tetris, and the controls are a little convoluted. Still, it's a neat little game and a great way to end the decade. Welcome to 1990. The new decade is upon us. The future is bright. Video games are big business, and the personal computer revolution is well underway. Which is why it's fitting that the first version of Tetris released for the new decade was the Microsoft Windows 3.0 version, included in the Best of Entertainment pack. This version has a decidedly early 90s appearance, but it works. You can play it in 1 or 2 player modes, and it has those simple and clean visuals that operate within the Windows environment. It's very early 90s. It's also very simplistic. You have a hard drop rather than a soft drop, and the ability to rotate the shapes in just one direction. It's supremely basic, but that's what early Windows games were all about, really. It's exactly the kind of game you would expect to find alongside Minesweeper and Solitaire, only it's Tetris, so it's even better. 1990 also saw the release of another Pajitnov game, Hatris for the NES. It's basically a hat matching game, which requires you to line up a number of hats as they fall in pairs while keeping the playfield clear. It's a strange little game, but surprisingly fun. Again though, the original Tetris concept remains the king in my book. 1991 then saw the release of 3 official Tetris games, 1 PC title, 1 Famicom game, and, well, a board game. On the PC, Spectrum Holobyte released Super Tetris, a strange take on the Tetris formula with VGA graphics and a new way to play Tetris. The main mode presents the player with a field of garbage blocks on the bottom half of the screen, taking up about 14 blocks in height, with a 14-block blank playfield above it. Using a mix of bombs and tetrominoes, players play a rather strange version of Tetris. It's certainly interesting and it has some relatively nice VGA graphics, but it's not the most engaging version of the game, I'll say. Over on the Famicom, however, Bulletproof Software returns with Tetris 2 plus Bombless. This is a surprisingly great game with two completely different takes on the Tetris formula. Tetris 2 is, well, Tetris. It plays much more like Nintendo's own Tetris game, but even smoother thanks to smooth object motion for shapes. Rather than clicking over in set intervals, each shape smoothly scrolls from position to position. It's not necessarily optimal for precise Tetris gameplay, but it sure looks smooth compared to virtually every other version of Tetris. It's a solid release of the game, and it plays a heck of a lot better than Bulletproof's original Tetris for Famicom. Visually, it has a very basic look with segmented blocks and a limited color palette, but I still find it rather attractive due to its smooth motion and simple, clean designs. Bombless, on the other hand, is an entirely new thing. This would be released in the States as Tetris Blast at a later date, and is basically a more puzzle-oriented take on the Tetris formula, but with bombs. The idea is to clear lines while chaining together bombs in order to clear the playfield. With colorful blocks, animated backgrounds, and smooth scrolling of the pieces, it's a fantastic version of the game and a fun concept in general. If you're looking for a different take on puzzling, this is a great addition, and it's not the last time you'll see it. 1992 then brings us 3 new Tetris games. Spectrum Holobyte returns once again with Tetris Classic, which is a simple version of the original Tetris for IBM PCs with upgraded visuals. Plus, it lacks all the funny business of Super Tetris. It's basically a classic-style Tetris game, as the name implies, with a lot of different modes and options and adjustable things. The enhanced graphics and the support for all sorts of different sound cards brings this in line with what you'd expect from a PC game during this era. It also adds the soft drop to the mix, and it generally plays really well. This is probably the best version of Tetris yet released on the PC as of 1992. Over on the Super Famicom then, in Japan, Bulletproof Software returns once again, this time with a port of Tetris 2 plus Bombless. It's basically an enhanced version of the original game, with Super added to the name. Thanks to its larger color palette, this version of the game features improved visuals, while removing the optional construction mode from the Famicom version. That's pretty much it though. It's the same basic game with some additional bombless puzzles and enhanced visuals and audio. But there's another version of Tetris released in 1992 that is perhaps a little strange and not as well known, and it's Tetris for the Philips CDI. This is both one of the best and worst versions of Tetris we've seen yet. Let me explain. Presentation-wise, this is one heck of a release. Using the enhanced CD capabilities of the system, the CDI version supports smooth, high-color, nicely animated nature scenes in the background and a nicely shaded playfield. In fact, the playfield itself almost stands as an obelisk towering over each serene environment. In addition, a completely chilled out soundtrack plays in the background, further enhancing the experience, and this is what is key to the CDI version of Tetris. It is such a unique experience and one of the first Tetris games that completely shifts the atmosphere of the game into a new, unexpected direction. In some ways, Tetris Effect feels like an evolution of the concept we see here. While the theme associated with the Game Boy game is most remembered from this era, my pick for the best Tetris soundtrack of its first decade is this version. It sounds amazing. Unfortunately, when it comes to actually playing the game, it's not very good. The CDI controller that I own just isn't good enough to enjoy Tetris. Combine that with the single direction spin and somewhat limited controls, and it just doesn't play very well at all, which is a shame as it could have been a fantastic version of the game with some tweaks and changes. From here though, we enter 1993 with a Super Famicom classic that unfortunately never left Japan. This is another Bulletproof Software game, and it's their best take yet on the formula. Tetris Battle Gaiden plays out in 2-player mode against either another player or the AI. Unlike your traditional Tetris experience, Both players draw from the same pool of tiles in the middle of the screen. Small orbs are included in some shapes, and eliminating the lines with these orbs grants you magic, which can be used by pressing up. The more orbs you save up, the stronger your attack. It's fantastic stuff. This version also features beautiful pixel art backgrounds and characters. There's lots of animation here, smooth motion of the blocks, and a beautiful color palette. In fact, it's the first anime-esque version of Tetris we've examined thus far, but it's awesome. The look, sound, and feel of Tetris Battle Guide N make it one of the essential releases. This is a must-own. 1994 then brings 3 other Tetris games to Nintendo's 16-bit machine: Tetris and Dr. Mario, Super Tetris 3, and Super Tetris 2 plus Bomb Bliss Limited Edition. Let's start with the last of the 3. This is just another release of Super Tetris 2 plus Bomb Bliss, with new Bomb Bliss stages, a modified title screen, and a new bulletproof logo. And that's about it. BPS also released the final in its trilogy of Tetris this year, Super Tetris 3. This goes for more of a Russian theme in many of its backgrounds and features many new style of block tiles. This version includes 3 game modes, including Tetris Classic, Magicalist, and Sparkless, which is basically just Bombless. All 3 modes are good fun, and this version, like BPS's other games, uses smooth motion for tetrominoes. It does feature lock delay though, so you can rotate after colliding with the block wall, and it generally plays pretty well. It's a solid, nice looking version of Tetris with plenty of extra options. Not a bad way to play the game. Nintendo also released a combo game featuring Tetris and Dr. Mario, which offers, well, Tetris and Dr. Mario. I haven't spent a lot of time with this one, to be honest, but it looks fairly nice, suitably 16-bit. The visual design is modeled after the tetrominoes themselves, with a lot of angles and simple designs reminiscent of the original NES release, which makes sense since these are basically enhanced SNES versions of original NES games. Both of them are good, and there's some interesting variants here, but it's nothing really that special, honestly. For 1995 then, we're looking at 2 games in this video. The first is yet another bulletproof software title, this time for Virtual Boy. Unfortunately, I lack the means to capture real Virtual Boy hardware, so I'm relying on emulation. I typically try to avoid using emulation in DF Retro, but in some cases there's just no way around it. So this is basically what it looks like then. The idea is that it's Tetris, with a pseudo 3D appearance during play thanks to the star field behind the playfield. It works surprisingly well, but is ultimately just another version of BPS Tetris, this time in red. My only complaint is that the lock delay window seems a little long for Tetris, resulting in annoying errors. A 3D version of Tetris was also released on Virtual Boy, but I had a difficult time getting this one to look quite right via emulation, but there it is. The other big 1995 Tetris release though is one of my favorites. I'm talking about Tetris Plus. This bad boy was released in the arcades initially in 1995 before being ported to the Sega Saturn, PlayStation, and Game Boy. We're looking at the PlayStation version here, but it looks about the same on Saturn. With cute characters, bright graphics, and tight Tetris gameplay, this is a charming, smooth-playing version of Tetris. But that's not the real draw here. You see, Tetris Plus is all about this amazing puzzle mode. Basically, you solve Tetris puzzles by making gaps large enough for the professor here to reach the bottom of the stage. Then it's on to the next puzzle. It features gorgeous 2D sprite work and beautiful backgrounds throughout. It's one of the most beautiful Tetris games we've seen yet. I love it. But then we come to 1996 with a pair of games to check out. The first is Tetris Blast for the Game Boy, which is basically a portable version of Bomb Bliss, and it's pretty good. As yet another BPS release, you get the same smooth shape movement and clean visuals. The move to black and white necessitates some slight design tweaks of course, but it's faithful to the NES original overall. This isn't really Tetris of course, but I still had to mention it. Then there's Tetris X on the PlayStation. No, it's not rated X unless you consider the flesh-colored Tetris blocks to be, well, slightly on the mature side. No, this is just a regular Tetris game, and from what I can tell, the first official Tetris game released in the post-Nintendo era on a home console. This is after the rights reverted to Pajitnov. Really though, this is just as basic a version of Tetris as you could ask for. The music is fairly generic, the look and feel is normal. I mean, it looks perfectly fine with some nice 2D pixel art graphics, but there just isn't much special here. It does control rather nicely though, I must admit, but it's a decidedly old school version of Tetris without any of the modern conveniences. Still good though. Which is also true of Tetris 64, released in 1998. This is a fairly basic Japanese-only Nintendo 64 game, and it's unique in that it's one of the few N64 games with straight traditional 2D pixel art graphics. As such, it's worth checking out for this fact alone. It also features a crazy mode known as Giga Tetris, which uses large shapes that can break apart into smaller pieces, which is cool, but there's one more insane feature here. Bio Tetris. This version of Tetris is just Tetris, but with one minor difference. You can use the Nintendo 64 biosensor produced by publisher Sega. Yeah, you attach this crazy thing to your ear and it measures your heart rate, varying the speed of the game based on the results. Vitality sensor, anyone? Yeah, it actually happened. No wonder this was Japan only. This same year though also saw the release of another portable Tetris game, Tetris DX. This is basically just a color-enhanced Tetris game to go along with the Game Boy Color. By this point, the killer app was fast becoming Pokemon, but Tetris still deserves its spot, and it's a solid, nice-looking version of the game with full-colored Tetronymos. It's a solid take on Tetris formula, but nothing really that special. Then we come to one of the best releases, Tetris, the Grandmaster. The first version was released in 1998 by Arika and introduces many of the features that would become standard in later revisions of the game. Spinning is very flexible and natural. The placement of your piece is highlighted along the bottom of the playfield, and the gravity or speed of the game rises and falls. Unlike most other revisions, the Grandmaster assigns a ranking to players based on performance in a move designed to encourage competitive play. It's fast, fluid, and fun. It also looks rather nice with simple, clean pixel art and fluid block movement. This initial version of the Grandmaster runs on Capcom's ZN2 hardware, which is very similar to an original PlayStation, which also powered games such as Rival Schools, Strider 2, and Street Fighter EX2. This is one of the best Tetris games in the market, but it would improve considerably with later releases. The last 1998 game that we're looking at today then is for the Sega Dreamcast. This is a super early release for the system and was developed by, no surprise here, Bulletproof Software. Yep, they're back again, this time with 3D graphics. This is a very fast, very playable version of Tetris. As a Dreamcast game, it runs at 640 by 480 with polygonal graphics at 60 frames per second. The backgrounds behind the playfield are of course fully 3D as well. Honestly, while it's a competent version of Tetris, it just feels a little drab overall and is still relatively limited in terms of feature set. It's Tetris, but nothing more, which makes sense for a launch window game. But in 1999, Sega itself took another shot at Tetris with Sega Tetris. Okay, well, this was released in the arcade on Naomi hardware in 1999. The Dreamcast version would follow later, in Japan, but hey. This was developed by WoW Entertainment and offers a suitably Sega presentation, with bright, bold colors, a smooth 60 FPS frame rate, and fully polygonal visuals. Sega Tetris takes on a very different look compared to Tetris 4D. It's crisp, it's beautiful, and it has a catchy soundtrack to match. Most importantly, the controls and mechanics feel like a great evolution of the original Sega Tetris, and even at higher speeds, it's relatively easy to perform well. The lock delay time is reasonable, and it features ghost blocks which show where your blocks will appear on the playfield. It's not quite as solid as Tetris the Grandmaster, I'd say, but it's a great little game for Dreamcast. Next up in 1999, we have the new Tetris for Nintendo 64, and this, my friends, is one of the best Tetris games to this point. The new Tetris introduces a lot of rules and mechanics that would become standard going forward. That means it has lock delay, soft and hard drops, along with a visible ghost piece to show where your block will fall. This version also introduces the option to see 3 blocks ahead and hold a piece for later use. All mechanics that would become important later on. This version also has a nice looking visual style. The blocks themselves appear to have a proper three-dimensional sheen with a large specular highlight visible across the playfield, while the backgrounds are beautifully rendered and animated. The whole thing just feels really slick, yet still very 90s. So who's responsible for this one, you ask? Well, it's H2O Entertainment, and that's important because they had released another Tetris-related project back in 1997 that I should also mention before we jump to the year 2000. I'm talking about Tetrisphere. That's right, this bizarre puzzle game started life on the Atari Jaguar as Fear, before showing up on N64. The goal of the game is rather different from a typical Tetris title, but it still offers a selection of modes for you to play with that are reminiscent in some ways. The core concept involves breaking through enough blocks to open the central compartment. This involves dropping blocks onto, well, other blocks, while moving these blocks around by holding the B button. You have 3 lives, and the pace of the game is generally slower and puzzle-like. Visually, it's an impressive showpiece with a large sphere made up of polygonal shapes with a suitable texture applied to them. N64's texture filtering smooths out the texels, resulting in a clean, smooth image. The frame rate is not perfect by any means, but it works for this specific game and it's reasonable by N64 standards. It's not really a Tetris game again, but it's still worth checking out. At this point though, we've covered a lot of Tetris games. Not all of them, mind you, but quite a few. Yet, there's so much more lying in wait. The turn of the century. Things are very different in the world of gaming. Nintendo is no longer the clear market leader, PlayStation rules the roost, and Sega is struggling to survive. And what's this Microsoft thing? Tetris, however, continues unabated. There are so many Tetris games released after the year 2000, so I'm just going to stick to a small selection of interesting examples. Otherwise, the Tetris effect itself may overwhelm me. And yet, we still have to talk about that game, of course. Let's kick off with the amazing Tetris, the Absolute Grandmaster 2, the sequel to the Grandmaster. This version continues to improve upon the original. Running on a Saikyo arcade board, TGM2 introduces more advanced background graphics and a smoother playfield. You get ghost blocks, soft and hard drops, and more. In addition, this version introduces the normal mode, which is more in line with traditional Tetris, rather than the exclusive master mode featured in the first game. It's a well-rounded package, but honestly, the series would get even better with its next installment. Well, before following up TGM2 in the arcade, developer Arika would make one stop at home by releasing Tetris with Cardcaptor Sakura Eternal Heart for the Sony PlayStation. Care for a little anime with your Tetris? Well, this game has you covered, and you know what? It's fantastic. The core mechanics are based on the TGM engine, so you know it plays well. But the core selection of game modes differs rather significantly from classic Tetris. The most intriguing is the story mode. Here, players go through a series of challenges while still shots and dialogue play out in between. This is essentially a puzzle mode. Each board presents a pattern with a handful of specific blocks you need to clear. You basically need to maneuver your pieces around the playfield to clear these blocks, then you move on to the next map. It's a concept similar to what we saw in Tetris Plus, and it's super well executed here. In fact, this is one of my favorite Tetris variants that we've discussed thus far. It also has a battle mode with traditional battle rules that allow you to play against another player or the AI. My only real complaint with the core gameplay here is the overly lengthy lock delay. Your piece simply takes a little bit too much time to lock into place, which can cause you to make errors if you're used to other versions of Tetris. It's a great looking game too. Large pixel art characters and drawings based on the series are displayed all over the place. Transitions are smooth and loading is super fast. It was a late generation PlayStation game, of course, and wasn't released in North America or Europe, which is a shame as it's a ton of fun and I suspect it would have done okay at a lower price. Definitely worth checking out now though. Next up is Tetris Worlds. This game was released across many different platforms, with each subsequent version improving upon the previous one. Unfortunately, I only have a copy of the game on PlayStation 2, and with the video already running so long, we should probably keep this one quick. The PC and PS2 versions were seemingly developed by Blue Planet Software, which, based on what I managed to dig up at least, seems to be the successor company to Bulletproof Software. Yep, BPS lives on. This version of Tetris wasn't especially well received at the time, but honestly it's pretty good, and many of its features would go on to define the Tetris rule set in the future, which makes sense as the company was helmed by Hank Rogers, who was key in obtaining rights to Tetris for Nintendo. Tetris Worlds features a lengthy lock delay with the ability to basically spin a piece freely until you desire to lock it down. At the time, this was considered cheating, but it works well and allows for super high-speed gameplay. Tetris Worlds also uses the super rotation system, which is defined by the current Tetris guideline as the standard. This influences how and where the tetrominoes spawn above the playfield. This version also includes both a soft and hard drop, but the hard drop immediately locks to the playfield. Tetris World sports 3D graphics and smooth 60 FPS performance as you'd expect, though I found the art direction to be somewhat on the dull side. Still, this is a good version of Tetris, and one that would influence the series going forward. From here though, there's a million other random iterations of Tetris, and I don't have many of them on hand, thus we're jumping straight to 2005 for one of the best Tetris games ever made, Tetris the Grandmaster 3 Terror Instinct. This is the third installment in the TGM series and features several modes and a slick new presentation. It offers many of the luxuries you'd expect from Tetris by 2005, with its own spin on things of course. Firstly, this one runs on the Taito Type X board, which is basically an Intel Celeron based PC running Windows XP embedded. Gameplay wise, TGM3 offers a new easy mode, which is something I had not seen before. It's basically Tetris with a tutorial. The game places ghost blocks designed to hint at optimal places. It seems to analyze the playfield dynamically and make suggestions based on the current situation, which is a neat way to ease new players into Tetris. Then there's the Sakura mode, which is derived from the PlayStation game I mentioned earlier. This is of course basically a puzzle mode just like that game, and I think it's a great addition to the TGM package. Then we have Master Mode, which is more or less the traditional mode from the TGM series. It's my favorite way to play the game. Lastly, there's the Shirase mode, and wow, this mode absolutely destroyed any notion that I could play Tetris at even a moderate speed. Basically, blocks drop onto the playfield instantly. It's just hard drops all day, and you need to rely on lock delay and spinning in place to survive. For me, it's basically impossible. I simply don't have the skills to pull this off, but it is rather addictive to try. Then you look at stuff like this, one of the world record holders, and it's just like, why even try? My jaw's on the floor here. Look at this. What I really like about TGM3 beyond the core mechanics though, is the presentation. With its excellent soundtrack and beautifully upgraded visuals to 640x480 compared to the previous two games at 240p, it just looks and feels great. There's even a variant of TGM for the Xbox 360, but it's region locked and I don't have a copy. Maybe someday I'll have a chance to check it out. Next up is another fan favorite, Tetris DS. This is one of the most complete versions of Tetris on a Nintendo platform and another amazing entry in the series. This one features lovely 2D pixel art visuals stylized after Nintendo characters. Gameplay occurs on a single screen, but it can bounce between them depending on the mode. The standard mode is typical Tetris, but you get these awesome background themes with Mario running through different stages as you progress. Then there's the mission mode, which pops up requirements the player must adhere to during gameplay, like clear 2 lines using a specific shape. There's even a touch mode, which involves sliding pieces around the screen to clear lines, and that's not even everything. This version of Tetris follows the modern Tetris guidelines, with the ability to rotate pieces as you please across the playfield and even climb over other blocks. The randomizer, block falling patterns, and inclusion of the ghost block are all very modern additions. Honestly, this is the best portable version of Tetris available as far as I'm concerned. The beautiful 2D visuals combined with excellent Tetris mechanics make for a great overall package. Check it out. Over the next decade then, Tetris would continue to release. EA released games, Ubisoft released a rather poor iteration of Tetris, and there's a lot of other releases as well. Some are good, some aren't, but there's a lot of Tetris. At this point, however, I feel like we have a pretty good grasp on what works and what doesn't with Tetris. I didn't think the game could get any better. I was wrong.
Close your eyes till you see my vision. Unite the souls so there's no division. Look into the future, we see all seasons. Aiming for the top, but what's the reason?
Tetris Effect is my favorite Tetris game by a large margin. This is the game that builds upon everything that makes Tetris great. It's modern Tetris, it follows the guidelines, it has hard and soft drops, lock delay, modern spawning, and more. Even with plain visuals, this would be a great version of Tetris, but there's so much more here. Tetris Effect is the next game produced by Tetsuya Mizuguchi, the man who helped bring Rez, Luminous, and Space Channel 5 to life. While his career started at Sega, working on games such as Sega Rally, he spent most of his time primarily focused on capturing synesthesia in video game form. And this is where the brilliance of Tetris Effect stems from. Tetris itself is already one of the most addictive, stimulating concepts in all of video gaming, but when you combine this with powerful music and imagery, it becomes something greater. During play, you focus primarily on the Tetris playfield itself. Every move you make is now accentuated with musical cues and sound effects. The background visuals wash over you as you play, while music fills the space around you. Speed does not increase in a linear fashion. Instead, gravity is adjusted based on the tempo of the music and the light show around you. The pace of the game quickens. The music becomes stronger, the visuals more intense. You can barely keep up. Then, just as you reach the breaking point, a calming sensation washes over you as the pace of the game and the tempo of the music slows down. The red fires are replaced with cooler hues. You take a deep breath. It's this emotional seesaw that works so well in this game. One part of your brain is laser focused on playing Tetris, but your other senses are sending different signals. It's powerful stuff. This is the ultimate realization of what Mizuguchi was aiming for all the way back in the year 2000. A perfect marriage of gameplay, music, and visuals. And these visuals play a huge role in the experience. Powered by Unreal Engine 4, Tetris Effect puts on quite the light show. GPU-accelerated particles fill every screen. Strange formations dance in the background and shapes glide effortlessly across the screen. There's a huge number of unique skins for this game, perhaps more than any other Tetris variant I've played, and each one of them is beautiful. It's a perfect fusion of art and function. In fact, the only complaint I could level with the game's presentation stems from the lack of support for high resolutions. I was hoping for native 4K output, but alas, it seems to be limited to 1080p, even on the PS4 Pro. It does, however, offer HDR support, which is a perfect match for this game specifically on an OLED TV. The intensity of the particle effects can be dialed up to a very high luminance, which contrasts perfectly against the beautiful black backgrounds. And the game is packed full of modes and options as well. There's a lot of different Tetris variants to enjoy. It's not just a simple game of Tetris. But it goes further. Playing Tetris Effect on a large TV is a great experience, but the game also supports PlayStation VR. This feels like the final evolution in Rez. Suddenly, you're present in the scene. The backgrounds now exist around you. Your peripheral vision is expanded as you focus on that central playfield, and it draws you further into the game. This is the ultimate audio-visual experience. VR is not used for gameplay purposes here, of course. Instead, it's designed solely to immerse you in this world, and it works. I'll say it again, this is the best Tetris experience I've ever had, and one of my favorite gaming experiences in decades. It's that good. The development team paid such close attention to all variants of Tetris released over the past several decades and ensured that this game could match them while expanding upon it in a new direction. Now, however, I believe we've reached the end of this rather lengthy journey. At the start of this video I mused, is Tetris the perfect game? In many ways, yes, it's a timeless formula that remains as engaging today as it did back in the mid-80s. The earliest versions of Tetris had a lot of room to grow, but we've seen some amazing examples of Tetris along the way. I've played a lot of Tetris games for this video and captured more than 10 hours of footage. As a result, I've found 5 games that I feel are the best Tetris games ever made. Number 5 is the new Tetris for Nintendo 64, which introduces the modern style Tetris gameplay that we all know and love. This is then followed by Tetris Plus, which is a beautiful, fun, puzzle-oriented game with a mean variant of standard Tetris. Plus, it looks absolutely gorgeous. This is then followed by Tetris DS, which I think is one of the most all-encompassing versions of Tetris available and the best portable Tetris ever made. Number 2 then is Tetris the Grandmaster 3 Terror Instinct, which is just an insane combination of weird crazy modes, beautiful visuals, and a pulse-pounding soundtrack. And number 1 is Tetris Effect, one of the only games that I would truly describe as the perfect game.
What could you be afraid of?